Today we are going to be discussing wasteful spending. I think it's particularly appropriate since we've just gone through an escapade or a situation where we've basically continued to do more of the same without any changes, a continuing resolution. And I think what we failed to do through doing that is we failed to look at particular problems like this one. The problem we're going to look at today won't balance the budget, but it would certainly be something that we ought to start somewhere with trying to cut out wasteful spending. So we're going to look today at the end of the year government spending binge and how spending goes up at the end of the year. Today's the last day of the fiscal year, and I think this should be of some concern. All last week and even all month, federal agencies have been ramping up their spending. Many studies have shown this. One of the witnesses, Dr. Fichtner, did I say good? Dr. Fichtner, has shown September spending will be nearly double that of August. Another study shows spending jumps nearly 500% over average in this last week. And in a clear effort to spend as much as possible, today's spending will move west in order to gain a few more hours in fiscal binging. West Coast spending will be 70% higher today compared to spending in the East. Today we're going to hear some examples of wasteful end-of-the-year purchases, and I'll start with one that we have in our little committee here. When I took over this subcommittee and we moved into the new office, we found printer cartridges stacked almost to the ceiling for a printer that was years out of date. So we asked, why would someone with the knowledge of this buy all of this stuff, and why would it be still sitting around? We found out that the previous chairman, or several chairmen back, bought the toner as part of an end-of-the-year spending binge, and that senator's now been gone for years, but the toners still remain. This practice will not continue under my chairmanship. This year, I am again going to turn back in nearly $500,000 from my own personal office budget. We're going to turn back money here in this subcommittee as well. More than just talking about problems, we want to find solutions. I have another possible solution or a way to help to end some of the wasteful spending, and this is called Bonuses for Cost Cutters Act. And what it would do is reward federal employees for identifying excess funds and actually turn those funds back into the Treasury. As you can imagine, every appropriator from both parties is opposed to my bill, but we think it would be another way to go forward with trying to actually reduce some spending by giving people bonuses. If you're in the private marketplace and you can save money for your employer, you often get a bonus. Why don't we give people, instead of having the perverse incentive to spend it all at the end of the year, why don't we actually give you a bonus if you'll turn it back in? We've had a great deal of discussion on the floor about controlling the power of the purse and how having a continuing resolution does nothing to really exert our power of the purse. There are too many, though, I think, who often don't care what we buy or how much we spend with their money. So another idea I have, other than giving federal employees bonuses, is why don't we give contractors bonuses as well for coming under budget? Instead of having programs where we simply add cost plus whatever it takes to get a project finished. I think really it is important that if Congress is to assert its authority of the power of the purse, that we look in every nook and cranny of the budget and look for ways to save money. To me, even when I was not in office, we often heard at every level of people having money at the end, use it or lose it, get rid of it, spend it, or you won't get it next year. And I think this still happens in government and has happened for a long time. And I, for one, hope that this committee hearing will go a ways towards trying to stop this. With that, I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, and I want to welcome everyone here today. We're here today to discuss end-of-the-year spending at agencies throughout the federal government. And I want to thank our witnesses who are here today, which we all know is the last day of the federal fiscal year. I look forward to your testimony that I think will help put these spending patterns that will be talked about into some perspective. The title of today's hearing is Prudent Planning or Wasteful Binge. It suggests that this is the day that federal agencies work through to spend what is left in their budgets, either as the result of managing funds to sustain unexpected costs or by any means necessary before the funds expire. And I imagine that if we were to check in with budget directors at federal agencies this afternoon, they would have something else on their minds. And that is whether the federal government will be open tomorrow. No doubt that they are examining resources and preparing their operations for any number of scenarios, including a shutdown, no matter how close leaders in the House and Senate say they are to passing and reaching a final deal. I know we did our work in the Senate earlier today, but it's not done yet. That's because the end of the year, the fiscal year that is, presents a deadline for Congress as well. And the political games that have resulted in another crisis, a manufactured crisis, if you will, that is driving us to the brink of yet another government shutdown. These are problems that we have seen before. Hardworking families in my state of Wisconsin and across the country expect and deserve better from the Congress of the United States. The people we represent get up every day and do their job, and it shouldn't be too much to expect that we do ours by keeping the government open for business and working together to get things done for the American people. This afternoon, we will examine if spending at the end of the fiscal year is, in fact, a source of waste in the federal government. But I think we already know that planning for a possible shutdown and operating on continuing resolutions are most definitely a source of waste. Even after a CR is passed, agency budget officers must spend time planning for the short term. Drifting from one crisis, budget crisis, to the next makes our government less efficient and more expensive for taxpayers. The 2013 government shutdown not only wasted resources and, frankly, weeks of productivity, it cost $24 billion in lost economic output. Our full committee described the failure to pass appropriations bills on time as part of, quote, crisis budgeting, when in 2013 it looked at the costs and impacts of operating through continuing resolutions, the threat of shutdown, and across-the-board budget cuts to federal programs through sequestration. 2 years later, not much has changed. And so how do federal agencies deal with the uncertainties of crisis budgeting? In areas where they have discretion to delay spending money, they do. And that's no different than anyone balancing their household budget would do. With all of this uncertainty, it is a reasonable response for budget directors to wait until later in the year when it is clear how much funding is available for staff training or staff generally, let's say. Agencies issue shorter grants and contracts with increased overhead costs and delay contracts until later in the fiscal year because it takes time for contracting officers to do their work. Squeezing contracts, grants, and purchases into the last few months of the fiscal year can certainly lead to inefficiency. When GAO surveyed agencies about the impact budget uncertainties have on their operations, the Bureau of Prisons Field Acquisition Office admitted that when a CR is in place, trying to complete their contracts of more than $100,000 each by the end of the fiscal year negatively affects the quality of competition. Resolving crisis budgeting may not reduce pressure to use it or lose it, as it's called, but it would certainly restore some certainty, some predictability. To only refer to money obligated in August or September as a spending rush or a wasteful binge assumes that at the end of the fiscal year, a federal agency would do just about anything to pad their budget. But as we all know, the need for staff, training, and technology are inexhaustible, and in our current budget environment, there are simply fewer resources for low-priority purchases. GAO found this to be true for most discretionary programs in their 1998 report on year-end spending and would likely find the same, I would say, in 2015. In my home state, we have a work ethic that's really second to none, and we pinch our pennies. And our people expect the same with their taxpayer dollars, that we invest in their future. So when we find egregious instances of wasted taxpayer dollars, it is our job to act, no matter at what point in the fiscal year that money is spent. The fact is that far too many Wisconsin families and individuals, despite their hard work, don't have extra money left in their own budgets at the end of the month or the end of the year. So stories about government spending their tax dollars on a truckload of flower pots or other such examples to avoid budget cuts are simply indefensible. I expect that we will have time this afternoon, Mr. Chair, to talk not only about what happens at the end of a fiscal year, but also continue the dialogue that the chairman and I have begun earlier this year about finding solutions to the problems of wasteful government spending. And I want to thank Chairman Paul for once again providing us an opportunity to root out wasteful spending. I look forward to our dialogue and conversation about the incentives built into our budget process and the extent to which they lead to decisions that waste taxpayer dollars.
Well, thank you, Senator Baldwin. I think that it is important to note that there is some agreement. I think continuing resolutions are a terrible way to run government. But I think it's also important to point out that this has been going on for a decade under Republicans and Democrats. It's both parties that have been a huge failure, and it's part of the reason why there's about 11% approval rating for Congress, because we don't do our job. End of the year spending won't balance the budget if we were to fix it. It is a phenomenon, and we should fix it. But we don't fix anything around here with a continuing resolution. Nothing gets better. We never examine bad spending or good spending, and nothing gets better. So I'm very, very frustrated with the process of the continuing resolution, and we'll continue to fight against that. At this point, I'd like to introduce our first witness, Dr. Jason Fichtner, who's a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. His research focuses on Social Security, federal tax policy, federal budget policy, retirement security, and policy proposals to increase savings and investment. Previously, he served in several positions at the Social Security Administration, including as acting Deputy Commissioner of Social Security. Most relevant today, he's the lead author of a paper published just last year entitled "Curbing the Surge in Year-End Federal Government Spending, Reforming Use It or Lose It Rules." The committee would like to, at this point, welcome Dr. Jason Fichtner.
Thank you, Senator. Good afternoon, Chairman Paul, Ranking Member Baldwin, Senator Lankford. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. My testimony focuses on two issues. First, the extent to which perception of a year-end spending problem is reality, and second, how various reforms would improve the efficiency of spending by federal government agencies and departments. From this discussion, I hope to leave you with the following two takeaways. First, while anecdotes and media stories of year-end spending surges are widespread, empirical evidence for year-end spending surges and use it or lose it spending, or the motivation behind the spending, is significantly less available. However, my research and recent research by other scholars is beginning to demonstrate empirical evidence that a year-end spending phenomenon is real and potentially wasteful. Second, allowing federal agencies limited rollover or carryover authority could reduce wasteful year-end spending splurges. Similar reforms at the state level and internationally have shown promise, but more research is still needed. The use it or lose it phenomenon refers to the propensity of U.S. government agencies to spend unused financial resources toward the end of the fiscal year. This spending is usually driven by fear that leftover resources will be returned to the Department of the Treasury and will prompt future congressional budget cuts for the agency. Economists Jeffrey Liebman and Neil Mahoney analyzed data from the Federal Procurement Data System and the White House's IT dashboard to show that not only is there a surge in federal spending at the end of the year, but also the spending is of lower quality. According to Liebman and Mahoney, Normally, at the end of the fiscal year, the prospect of expiring funds causes agencies to spend all their remaining resources, even if the marginal value is below the social costs of those funds. The International Monetary Fund found that year-end spending surges are a commonly observed phenomenon in government administrations. Such surges have occurred in Canada, Taiwan, and the United Kingdom, just to name a few. My research analyzed publicly available data from USAspending.gov related to spending on prime contracts awarded by executive departments. My analysis focused on this type of spending, which is comprised roughly 12% of total 2013 federal spending, because the data are readily available throughout the USA Spending Data Archive. My research shows that a remarkably large percentage of executive branch contract spending occurred near the end of the fiscal year. If an agency were to spread its contract authority evenly over a 12-month period, roughly 8.3% of spending would occur each month. However, in the last month of fiscal year 2013, the Department of State spent 38.8% of its contract expenditures, and the Department of Health and Human Services spent 28.7%. Now, not all agencies exhibited a year-end spending surge. For example, the Department of Energy spent only 6% of its annual contract expenditures in September. But as the data show, most federal agencies were well above 8%, and many were above 16%. Between 2003 and 2013, the data I looked at, across all executive departments, 16.9% of obligated contract expenditures occurred during the month of September. That's more than twice what we would expect if spending were split evenly over 12 months, again, 8.3% per month. It's important to point out that the pattern of fiscal year-end spending surges is evident across all fiscal years analyzed and is not unique to the current administration or the past few Congresses, as Senator Paul referred to. Year-end spending surges have become the norm, regardless of administration, party control of Congress, or delays in finalizing agency appropriations. Academic research and some anecdotal evidence suggests that the current budget rule of use it or lose it is not optimal and may be encouraging wasteful spending of taxpayer dollars. The question remains, if such spending is indeed wasteful, what can be done to reduce it? One idea is to allow agencies limited rollover authority, also known as carryover, for funds not spent by the end of the fiscal year. The federal government could begin with a pilot exercise to test the merits of limited rollover authority. Within certain federal departments, agency subcomponents could be given the authority to roll over up to 5% of contract budget authority into the next fiscal year. To avoid lengthy delays in the spending of rollover funds and to discourage large accumulation of such rollover funds, such funds should be spent within 2 years. Department or agencies that wish to participate in the pilot could submit a request to Congress, which could then direct the Government Accountability Office to oversee, audit, and evaluate the program. Executive departments should be required to submit mid-year budget reviews to Congress and the GAO. These reviews would detail, by agency subcomponent, the anticipated expenditures for the remainder of the fiscal year, the anticipated surpluses at the end of the fiscal year, and the reason for these surpluses. Mid-year reports with similar components have yielded success in reducing use it or lose it pressures and year-end spending surges when tried here at home in Oklahoma and overseas in Taiwan. A pilot program that gives limited rollover authority to several departments combined with congressional and GAO oversight of rollover accounts would be a useful experiment to see whether these changes to the federal budget process would reduce wasteful year-end spending. Thank you for your time and this opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Fichtner. Our next witness is Dean Sinclair of Changing the Culture in Washington. Mr. Sinclair was a longtime federal employee overseeing multi-million-dollar contracts. This was particularly the case when he was the executive director of the Iraq Scientist Engagement Program for the Department of State in Baghdad. Mr. Sinclair is keenly aware of the use it or lose it phenomenon and is deeply troubled by it. I'm looking forward to hearing more about your experiences and getting your insights. Mr. Sinclair.
Thank you, Chairman Paul, Senator Baldwin, and subcommittee. Thank you for letting me join you today. I have a lifetime of experience working both sides of the fence as a contractor and as a direct hire for the U.S. government, as both in the military, in the Army, and in the Department of State. I'll start with the story that you referred to, Senator Baldwin. There was an ambassador in Africa who asked his facility manager to order 4 flower pots. And thinking about it, he came back to that facility manager and said, hey, you know, it's the end of the year. I have a big budget there. Why don't you buy a truckload of flower pots for us? And the facility manager, who I spoke to personally firsthand, hated himself for having to do that. He was disgusted with the whole process, but of course he did it because he was asked. And So he got the flower pots in Africa. Who knows where they came from? When they showed up, they took 4 of them out, put them around the embassy where they were needed, and the rest were put behind a building and left just to rot in the sun, because you can't let them go. You can't give them away because of the rules. You can't sell them. You had to keep them. Now, you have to wonder, that was an ambassador. I'm sure he or she sometimes risked his or her life in the course of their duty, like I was doing in Iraq for 9 years, just to do our job. It was often a very insecure thing. We're doing things that are for the benefit of America. Oftentimes, it has direct impact on our national security. These are not disloyal people. These are not people who are out to just do evil things to America. If that's the case, then what's happening? What causes a person to make such an egregious decision about wasting money at the end of the year? And my thought, after all these years, is that they don't have any incentive to do it. At the end of the year, and let me give it to you clearly, there are 3 steps that I think need to take place on this end of it. For the employees themselves to voluntarily come forward and not waste the money, but spend it effectively and efficiently. 3 things need to happen. 1, at the end of every year, they're all evaluated. They get an employee evaluation form. You won't find on that form a good statement that says, have you spent your money that's been budgeted? And if you did and completed your program, well, that's one of the best check marks you can get. However, if you happen to complete your mission and return surplus money to the Treasury, well, that should be the highest check mark an employee gets on their annual evaluation. Notice, you don't have to build a bureaucracy. You don't have to come up with a new program. You just need to put it in there, and it's not. If you check, and I have, it's not in there in a way that effectively evaluates employees that way. Another one, with no bureaucracy, no extra programs attached to it. Simple public recognition is one of the most effective motivating tools for employees. And if at the end of the year they turn money back, and that surplus money, they should get, like I did, I got 2 plaques for having an outstanding program in Iraq from an undersecretary and from the ambassador himself. You better believe I worked hard for those. And at the end of the year, if people have turned money back in, why not just give them the plaque? Hey, that's what we wanted. Do it in front of the whole organization and put it in their personnel record and probably in the local news source for that agency. I was written up in the agency in, it was the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers magazine. That was the proudest moment of my life, just to see that news article. So the third one, Senator Paul, is exactly what you said. I know you did it in a bipartisan effort with Senator Mark Warner, and that is, why not give people a bonus of some sort? And I'm not saying a large one, but I personally turned back $1 million of an 8.5, when I was running an $8.5 million program. And when I did that, the people I was working for, they looked at me like deer in the headlights. I've never seen this before. What if they had just given me a little bonus for doing the right thing? Those are the 3 things that you need to do to get the people on board to support not wasting money at the end of the year.
I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce Dr. Philip Joyce and add my personal thanks to you, Dr. Joyce, for being here today. Dr. Joyce is Associate Dean and Professor of Public Policy at the University of Maryland and has spent more than 30 years practicing and studying budgets at CBO. the Illinois Bureau of the Budget, and the Illinois Department of Corrections. He is the author of a report detailing the costs of budgeting uncertainty based on his research and interviews with current and former government officials. That report describes the effects of late appropriations on federal agency operations over the last 35 years and explains how federal budget officers have attempted to address greater levels of uncertainty every year. That report is relevant today as Congress votes to keep the government open. Dr. Joyce testified before our full committee in 2013 and talked about year-end spending in the context of budget uncertainty, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the panel here today to provide us with your insight. Thank you, and we await your testimony.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman Paul, Senator Baldwin, Senator Langford, members of the subcommittee. I'm very happy to be here today. My message to you today is a relatively simple one. That is, I think that end-of-year spending is real. I think it is potentially a problem to the extent that funds are wasted. I don't think in the overall scheme of things it is perhaps the highest priority problem that we have. But if end-of-year spending is real, I do want to point to something else that is real as well, and that's the uncertainty that's created by the dysfunction of the appropriations process. I think end-of-year spending, to some extent, is a predictable and understandable response by federal agencies to the incentives that they face, and that creating more certainty in the process would actually do far more to curb waste and inefficiency in government than trying to rein in end-of-year spending. But first, I want to acknowledge that spending, particularly for contracts and other types of non-salary items, is backloaded, at least in relative terms. And this, by the way, is not peculiar to the federal government, as has been suggested. There are lots and lots of governments where this is an issue. I started my career as a budget analyst in the Illinois State Budget Office. The fiscal year started on July 1st. June was a very busy month. So this is not something that's peculiar to the federal government. A lot of this at the federal level has to do with the laws that govern federal spending. Agencies cannot overspend their appropriations because of the Anti-Deficiency Act. On the other hand, they are supposed to spend the funds that have been appropriated because of the anti-impoundment statutes. So it's quite prudent for agencies to set aside funds until they know that they have the money. To that extent, end-of-year spending could be a prudent response to the incentives that they face. But that's not to suggest that agencies don't sometimes spend money just to avoid losing the funds, and that they also don't sometimes spend money in order to protect their budgetary base for a future fiscal year. So it's not an excuse for wasting funds on unneeded expenditures, not only at the end of the year, but any other time. But if one's to get a handle, I think, on the real problem, I think it's important to be clear about the distinction between end of year and wasteful, because the two are not synonymous. The key question here has to do with the quality of spending, not necessarily the timing of spending. And if one looks at the GAO high-risk list, for example, there are a whole lot of examples of fiscal exposure, larger fiscal exposures than end-of-year spending. For example, there's the $80 billion annual cost for Medicare and Medicaid improper payments, which I would say substantially dwarfs the cost of end-of-year spending. So in relative terms, I would say we're not talking about a lot of money, but to the extent that some spending is wasted at the end of the year, it may be useful to curb the practice. Among other things, it actually does a lot of damage to the credibility of the federal government when these kinds of examples come to light. But how? That's where I think budget uncertainty comes in. 2 years ago, as Senator Baldwin said, I testified at a hearing held by the full committee designed to highlight the harmful effects of budget uncertainty. We know what happened this year, but this year is not unusual. There have only been 4 times in the last 40 years that the appropriations process was completed on time. And it's a good thing to avoid government shutdowns, but government by CR is no prize either. In the sense that it creates a lot of uncertainty, and that uncertainty itself causes waste. Late appropriations push many contract renewals to later in the year. That creates a greater potential to make mistakes. It increases the cost of contracts, either because savings can't be locked in or because contractors sometimes exact a risk premium for dealing with the federal government because of the uncertainty that they face. In addition, agencies waste a great deal of time and therefore money preparing for potential government shutdowns and also interpreting what they are permitted to do and not do under a continuing resolution. The effects of budget uncertainty, of course, are also felt by recipients of federal funds, such as state and local governments and private contractors. All this suggests that our normal dysfunctional way of doing business creates a lot more waste and compromises the effectiveness of government far more than does end-of-year spending. And no state or local government could get away with this. Chronic funding delays would result in lower bond ratings, in increased borrowing costs, and a lot of political fallout. So my purpose here is not to defend waste. Wasteful spending, regardless of the magnitude or the timing, should be avoided. It's that end of year and wasteful are not synonymous, and that in the current fiscal environment, end of year spending practices are an entirely understandable, even reasonable response to the dysfunction and unpredictability of the appropriations process. I think making that process work better would not only reduce end of year spending, but would also improve the overall effectiveness of government. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Senator Langford.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member, thank you. I appreciate that. Dr. Joyce, let me pick up where you just left off there, and that is this broken process. As you mentioned, I believe you said 4 times in the last 40 years appropriations have been done on time and in order with the 12 appropriation bills at the scheduled moment. That is not just a broken process, that's a shattered process, and it's got to be fixed. One of the ideas is being floated is some way to be able to build in an incentive. Congress only seems to get stuff done when they have to get it done, and at that point, even at the last moment, to build in some sort of process that would create certainty in 2 areas. One is that the appropriations process will be done, and the other one is that we don't have shutdowns. So one idea being floated is that at the end of a fiscal year, we'd have an automatic short-term CR that would kick in for 30 days, but that there would be a cut in the budget for the legislative branch, both the House and the Senate and our committees and the White House Executive Office, just limited to those folks that actually do the negotiation. We'd have a small budget cut. That budget cut would increase the next month and the next month to push Congress to actually get its work done. That's not damaging other agencies. They're still functioning, but it's trying to create an arbitrary deadline, but to put it on Congress. There's really no difference between October the 1st right now and December the 11th. We just created another deadline, but there's nothing going to change between the two. So trying to find some sort of pressure point to create to do that. Have you heard of that kind of idea? But I agree, CRs are a terrible way to do it. But if we trip over into a October the 1st, I don't want to have the instability as well. I want us to get to the appropriations process. Be interested in your input.
I think any kind of incentive that you create, if you believe that it would work, would be a good thing. I do think that what might end up happening in that case is that the real deadline, to the extent there is one, would just shift from being October 1st to November 1st. That is, the point at which somebody believes that something that matters to them is actually going to happen is the point at which someone will actually get down to doing the job. And when I interviewed people for this 2013 study, one of the striking things that I found is a lot of people out there in federal agencies, and this I think accounts partially for the movement of contracting toward the end of the year, actually don't believe they're going to get an appropriation on October 1st, and therefore they view normal as January 1st because they've experienced that.
Right. And so that's the fixable moment that we've got to find a way to be able to add leverage basically to Congress and to the White House, that in our negotiations, all 3 parties can get together and try to get this done on time.
Correct.
Try to get us back to that. So we'll continue to explore that together in the days ahead. Let me ask this group as well. The idea about floating a cap of what you can do in contract spending or in total spending. As you mentioned before, the 8.3% would be the normal in the process. If you did a cap saying that you could do no more than 12% of your budget in the final 2 months, would that make a difference, or would that basically, instead of being September, now you would have this big massive spending in July?
I think, Senator, you already hit the perverse incentive in your question, which is one of the things, the problem we have is there's a deadline that forces agencies to spend without being able to roll over any sort of authority to the next fiscal year. And if you move that 1 month up, my guess is you'd see the data show that 1 month up would then be a year-end spending splurge as well. So the idea is not necessarily changing the date, but how do you change the incentives or the structure of the budget process to give them a different incentive to roll over money and spend it more prudently?
Right. Because the key really here is oversight and to make sure that things are done well, and that when there is wasteful spending, rather than just they were being careful with budgets and making sure they didn't go over, that's understandable to be able to leave that. The problem is at the end of it, for leftover funds need to be returned to the taxpayer and to what's happening in debt reduction rather than spent on flower pots.
Another thing that happens is when you come up with rules like that, then people, they work to the rule. And what it does not address is that culture, that cultural mindset of wasteful spending, that's acceptable. And if you change that, then you won't need to worry as much about those caps.
Okay. One last question as well about the carryover authority as well. Oklahoma has that in some of our agencies and within the state, has the ability to be able to do carryover. Again, how does that not just incentivize agencies to carry over and then spend twice as much, I guess?
Well, again, Senator, your point is changing the incentives, and you also mentioned the idea of congressional oversight. This can't be done in a vacuum. So one of the things I recommend is a pilot that looks to the states for where they were successful, and part of that success is having mid-year reports.
Okay, do you have an agency that you'd recommend as a pilot on that? Be a good candidate?
Right now, I would start with Department of State and also Department of Health and Human Services, sir.
Why? Because they spent 38% in the final month?
That is part of it. They are the two biggest outliers, and I think they are also the two biggest examples with the anecdotes that show where waste is. So we could control waste and also then change the incentives at the same time. It could be a double win.
Thank you. Yield back.
sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Langford. And the only thing I would add to that is if you're going to cut someone's budget as an incentive, if you actually cut salaries, that might be more of an incentive. Now I'd like to recognize Senator Baldwin.
Thank you. I know, Mr. Chairman, you yielded to Senator Langford because he has another obligation. Are you sure?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you all for your testimony. I very much appreciate it. So I know we're focusing in on the federal government and particularly the executive branch. But Dr. Joyce, you said in your testimony that year-end spending is not unique to the executive branch of the federal government, nor is it unique to government at any level, and perhaps not even to government. There may be examples of use it or lose it within the private sector operating on fiscal year calendars. I'm sure if there was a silver bullet answer to the problem, you would have offered it in your testimony. But are there examples of budget directors outside of the federal government, finding useful tools that we should be looking at to address the waste that can be present in year-end spending?
Well, I think there are two things I would say. The first is that, the premise of your question, which is that this is a phenomenon that exists across lots and lots of organizations, is absolutely correct. And the reason for that is because most organizations have budgets that are time limited. That is, most organizations have some point in time when the fiscal year ends. And any time you have that situation, you are going to create incentives for those people to try to use the money that they have before it disappears, unless there's some way to incentivize them to not do that. So the only thing that I am aware of is, is trying to exercise more oversight. That is, if you think that end-of-year spending is actually a problem and that the spending at the end of the year might tend to be for less high-priority items, that you create some additional checks. For example, when I worked in the Illinois Budget Office, when agencies were trying to spend a lot of money at the end of the year, they actually had to get our approval in order to do that if it occurs in the last quarter of the year for some things where they didn't have to get that approval if they had spent the money earlier in the year, just as an example.
Just out of curiosity, I came from state level government prior to the local and then state level prior to the Congress of the United States. Wisconsin had a 2-year budget.
Right.
And you talked about the propensity for backloading or these expenditures just because you get a budget and it takes you a while to begin to implement, especially anything that requires any length of time to transpire, whether it's looking at competitive bids for contracts, et cetera. Have you had the opportunity to examine others that do a 2-year budget, and I'm not necessarily a proponent of that, but how does it change the behavior? Do you see less backloading in different budget lengths?
Dr. Fichtner may have looked at that. I have not looked at it. I think logically what one would think would occur under a 2-year budget, and I have some reservations for other reasons about a 2-year budget, but in terms of this specific question, I think that the incentives would occur half as often if what happened was that you had funds available for 2 years as opposed to having funds available for only 1 year.
Okay. I wanted to explore further, Dr. Fichtner, your comment or your ideas about rollover authority. You talk about the federal agencies being allowed to keep a portion of their unobligated funds to reduce the incentives created under use it or lose it. What safeguards would you propose be in place to ensure that these funds, which I think would arguably be subject to less oversight once they were removed from the regular appropriations process, so that these funds don't become more susceptible to wasteful spending once rolled over?
Yeah, no, Senator, it's an excellent question. In fact, I would actually give them more scrutiny, not less, in the congressional process, including having GAO monitor it. So one of my concerns, and I think you're showing this as well, is if you give an incentive to an agency to have rollover authority, they may on purpose not spend money that Congress has authorized and appropriated for the funds intended, just to show they can get a bonus or just to show they've saved money and roll it over. So what I would do is have a pilot in which they apply to Congress so that Congress can have a chance to have witnesses up, ask them, why do you think your program is best suited for rollover authority? How do you plan to do it? And then have mid-year reports that goes to Congress. GAO evaluates it to make sure that they are spending it appropriately and not just putting it in what's called a rat hole. That's very insightful, and that's how I would put some protections on it, Senator.
And any other comments on that, Dr. Joyce?
Well, on rollover authority, actually, going back very far into history, when Vice President Gore was vice president, there was a reform called Reinventing Government. And one of the specific recommendations of Reinventing Government was that agencies be able to keep 50% of the money that they saved at the end of the fiscal year. The trick from an agency perspective is that they have to believe that in the executive process, OMB will not take that money out of their base for the next fiscal year. So they have to believe that they will actually get to keep and spend it, as opposed to it will just become a reduction in next year's budget. So everybody has to sort of agree to play along in order for the game to work.
And the congressional process as well.
Right, correct.
Right. Points that you both made. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
I'd like to have this question really for the panel. You know, we've put forward a bill that Mr. Sinclair mentioned, and it's a bill to basically give incentives. We've talked about incentives for your budget or for our general budget, but I think people respond best to incentives that actually have to do with themselves. In our bill, basically, we put forward, and someone has to approve that they've done what they were told to do. Basically, your agency has a mission, and I believe we have the chief financial officer and an inspector general both have to certify that you've performed your mission. But see, I think throughout an enormous government that spends $3.8 trillion, that, you know, the cartridges that are piled up in our room back here, that somebody, if they thought they were getting, you know, a $1,000 bonus by not ordering $10,000 worth of printer toners, they probably wouldn't have done it. And this does work. And as far as end of the year spending, it would only work in a corporation or happen in a corporation where there's not good oversight and where it's so big and bureaucratic that it's somewhat like government. In a well-run business, it would never happen because the incentives would exist throughout, and you would want to be pleasing your boss to get a promotion to save money. You would be telling your boss, hey, I ordered 30% less toners this year, so we saved the company money, and you'd expect something for that. But I'd like to know, just each of you individually, what you think of the idea of giving personal incentive. I personally, and nothing personal, don't think much of carrying the money over to the next year. It might help a little bit not to have the crunch of everybody trying to get rid of it, but it really doesn't give anybody the incentive to give it back to the people whose money it is, which is the taxpayer. When we start with Jason and work our way down.
Thank you, Senator. I think actually your idea and the bill is a very good idea. What I would also do is couple it with the rollover spending, because one of the things you want to do is make sure incentives align. If you give the employees an incentive, but the management does not have an incentive to rollover authority, then basically they might look at their employee poorly and say, hey, you just gave money back, Congress is going to take it away next year, and you've ruined my career. That's one of the things Mr. Sinclair was pointing out. So I would look at this as a tandem idea of giving the incentive to the employee to identify fraud, waste, and wasteful spending with a dollar award.
Well, one thing on that, you
well.
could sort of share the incentive and make everybody part of a team where the guy at the very top or the woman at the very top is also getting a piece of the action as well. And so I think there could be something where the whole agency could even take a little small portion of the savings, and the guy or the woman who found the big savings gets a bigger percentage chunk, but then it spreads throughout the whole agency. People just react to stuff that affects them personally.
I agree, Senator. The other thing I would mention, because I'd mentioned this to Mr. Sinclair, and we've talked about this, is changing the incentives for the senior executive service. They have performance reviews every year, which are based on some qualities and assessments, and one of them is business acumen. That should include something that says if fiscal dollars aren't spent appropriately, or you come in over too much, or you're on the budget and not going, you're not under. If you're spending carryover too much and you're not spending, or you're spending at the year end too much, you can't get a high bonus award.
Yeah, I like that idea, and I think maybe we should look at our bill to see about adding that to our bill about the way we review employees. I think that would be good as well.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Senator, I looked at your bill too, and I liked what I saw. It had protections in there so that there would be review, because there was also the possibility of abusing that system. You know, let's pad my budget so I can turn some money back and get a bonus at the end of the year. That would be a hardship.
But they don't create their budget, we create the budget, right?
Well, but they would tell you what they need, so let me expand on what I think I need so that I can get a bonus.
I think that already occurs without the bonus.
But so essentially what I'm saying is I'm agreeing with you that since you have protections in there, that's a good thing. Money is one of the three motivations that I recommended. It's not the top one though. I think is an excellent one if you don't make it like, you know, if I've saved $1 million, how much should I have received for that as a bonus? Well, in my mind, $1,000, $2,000, is that a good bonus for the government to save $1 million? It seems fine. That's just a suggestion.
Right.
I would like to point out, though, that we pretty much agree here on this panel on everything except probably one thing, and that is the magnitude of the problem. It is a serious, hugely important problem. I think it's an unseen problem, and the reason I say that is because people who have this mindset that they have to get rid of that money throughout the year are making bad decisions about that money. And some of those decisions have to do with things like our national security. And notice the recommendations that I have said. I'm not talking about eliminating agencies or anything. I want every agency to work well.
Well, I think one of the point I'd make is that even if it's not 50% of the budget or 50% of the problem,
Correct.
if it's 1%, if you take 1% savings across the board and you compound it, it adds up to real savings. I mean, you actually can balance your federal budget, as bad as it is now, with 1% real compounded savings over a 5-year period. I'd like to have Dr. Joyce comment, and then I'll be done.
Yeah, the only comment I would add is that you do not provide federal agencies and programs with money as an end in and of itself.
Phil.
You don't provide agencies and programs with money as an end in and of itself. You provide agencies and programs with money because there are particular missions and jobs that you want them to do. So the only thing that I would add in is that you would have to make sure that the saving of money was not an end in and of itself, but that you also factored in what did you accomplish with the money that I provided you. And if you can accomplish what you're supposed to accomplish and simultaneously save money, then I think you're really onto something.
I'd appreciate it if all of you would look look at our bill, we do have that in there, a safeguard to try to make sure you are accomplishing your mission. But if you'll all look at the bill, it's a very short bill. I am open to suggestions from Senator Baldwin as well. We need more Democrats on this. We have one Democrat right now, so we need more. I don't think we're going to get any appropriators. They just don't care. I mean, and that's just sad to say. But I would appreciate any kind of influence from you that says that we could change the bill in one way, and we will look at that. And we'd also look at it from Senator Baldwin if you would come on board or willing to take suggestions. Senator Ernst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. And Dr. Joyce, I will echo what you said about all levels of government. I started my elected career as a county auditor. And of course, we saw some of these same issues at a much smaller scale, the county level. One of the things, of course, we had the contract spending at the end of the year, but one of the things that we implemented to try and control that end of year spending, something that we can think about at the federal level, have discussions on. But when the budget was set for the fiscal year, at the beginning of the year, of course, ours was a July 1st fiscal year as well. At the beginning of that fiscal year, our county supervisors would only authorize a certain percent of the budget. And when you hit that mark, then that department would come back in and then justify the rest of their spending going forward. That might be cumbersome, but it did slow down that end of year and unwarranted expenditure. So that was something that we utilized, and it did help. I do want to go back to some of your testimony, Dr. Fichtner. You provided some graphs and charts in your testimony. Thank you for doing that on the agency contract expenditures. And this is a big issue. The State Department, I can't believe it, at the end of every year, and HHS, well above the average with other contract spending authority compared to other agencies. And so what is the State Department spending 38% of its entire contract budget on in that last month of the fiscal year? Can you explain to us what that is?
Senator, I wish I could in detail. There's anecdotes about them wasting money on $1 million granite statues, $5 million for STEMware for the embassies. This report was a year ago. It was done based on fiscal 13 data. Because I was testifying today, just over the weekend, I played around with USAspendingdata.gov just to look at the State Department, because someone asked, well, how much is done on the last year of the fiscal year? How much is done today? I went, oh, that's an interesting question. So I pulled up just the State Department fiscal 14-year contract data. And of the entire year, there's roughly 19,500 contracts that they manage and sign. At the end of the fiscal year, just on the last day of the fiscal year, there were 2,000 contracts signed. Now that's only 0.2% of all contracts. Big deal. However, the dollar magnitude was 8.4% of the entire dollar amount for the fiscal year. So to get to the point of is this a wasteful binge or prudent spending, I'd argue a little from column A and a lot from column B. It is a problem. The question is what the magnitude and what can we do about it, and that's the issue.
Right, very good. Yes, Dr. Joyce.
If I could just add, one of the things that I found when I was talking to people in federal agencies about this research that I was doing a couple years ago is that agencies have responded to the delays in the appropriations process by making sure that contracts don't come up for renewal during the early part of the fiscal year, because they don't want contracts to come up for renewal at a point where they don't know how much money they're going to have. So I haven't looked at the data to the extent that Dr. Fichtner has, but a lot of this, and this is why I focus on the uncertainty of the appropriations process, a lot of what occurs in terms of incentives for federal agencies pushes them to try to renew contracts later in the year just because they don't know whether they're going to have the money or they don't know how much money they're going to have.
Right, very good. And it's not just the State Department, it's not just HHS. I'm going to hit one other agency that I think has the potential to do so much good for so many men and women that have put their hand up sworn to defend and uphold our Constitution and defend, our freedoms here in the great United States, and that is Department of Veterans Affairs. It really could do so much more for us, and yet what we have seen in recent years is just scandal after scandal with the Veterans Administration. And they are going through some tough times, I would say right now. However, they bring that on themselves. I'm not going to offer any excuses for them. Do you think, and this is for everybody on the panel, do you think an agency like the VA should be spending $562,000 on artwork in 1 week?
So, Senator, what I would say is, as you pointed out, part of the comment is that a part of Veterans Affairs has a lot of problems right now. Some of it also is leadership, in which the culture of the agency from the staff level is trying to report to Congress whistleblower activities, and they're getting pushed back by the managers, by the executives. I think that should be somewhere Congress could focus on how to help those employees stand up and report to Congress where the abuse is happening.
Exactly. Thank you. There was
Something else out.
Yes, go ahead,
that.
Mr. Sinclair.
It took time and energy to waste that money. A lot of time and energy. And
Of course it did.
I can give you an example from the Department of State. That's who I worked for. The $1 million that I was ready to turn back was, they told me in August, we need you to spend this by the end of September. Well, my program had been one of the most successful in the embassy, but it took a lot of work to get it there. And the reason I said I can't do it right now is because my program will be hurt if I try to spend that money. Let's put it in the budget for next year. I think we could do something reasonable with it. But that was not an acceptable answer.
That's not the right answer in today's age, is it? And that's very unfortunate. Going back to the artwork at the VA, there was a Washington Post article from 2 years ago that outlined some of the spending agencies or the spending that the agencies are doing in those last few weeks. And this is just one of those examples. You know, we have some great therapeutic programs for our veterans. They do artwork. Why are we not using that artwork in our VAs? Wasteful spending. We have to do better for our taxpayers. We certainly should be doing better for our men and women in uniform and those veterans. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We mentioned a little bit about giving incentives to federal employees. I think there also could be a similar type financial incentive program for contractors, and maybe there is that I'm not aware of, but while we're talking about the VA and waste, and we could go on, the Veterans Hospital in Aurora, Colorado is going to cost $1.8 billion. It's a 182-bed hospital. It's nearly $10 million per hospital room. It's outrageous. It ought to be wallpapered with gold to have cost that much. But I'm wondering whether or not we could do something similar with contractor money, is that if you were contracted and you were given $1 billion and you were told 50 million of it was profit for you and the rest was the cost of building something, couldn't we say that if you can do it for $800 million and you save the government $150 million, that maybe you get a percentage of the savings instead of what we do the opposite? You know, we give you just whatever your costs are, we'll give you a cost plus, whatever the profit margin is. But I really think that we could work in incentives into the contracting process as well. If each of you will comment on whether or not you know if any of that exists or what you think of the idea.
So, Senator, I'm not sure if it exists in the federal government. I know in the private sector, there are a lot of examples where they try to give incentives to contractors. And what they do is there's performance bonuses for finishing early, not just on time, but early, in budget, and in quality. And so you could do something in the federal government that basically
You could do it on time, and you could do it on coming in under budget,
Right.
and then you get a percentage of
So the only thing you want to avoid is the perverse incentive for a contractor to then pad the estimate. But if you have a very competitive process, that should eliminate that.
Exactly. Anybody else?
I just agree with that. I think it would be useful. It would only be one tool, though, and I think a bigger problem probably is the plus-ups that the client, the federal government, would give to the contractor over time, and also the continuing resolution problem. When you don't know when your contract starts, you always have to add money to it. So I like your idea, but it's only one element that we need.
Yes, I want to follow up directly on that. I mean, I don't want to hit the same note over and over again, but I think the uncertainty is really a big issue for contractors as well. So I think if you're going to try to rein in waste in terms of contractors, I think contractors also would benefit from a lot more certainty in the budget process. I will say that I've not studied this at the federal level, but I was involved in a study of the 50 state governments and their management processes a few years ago, and there was a wide variation in terms of the states in the extent to which they did what Dr. Fichtner was describing, which is really performance contracting. So they, a performance contract basically says we're going to write into the contract up front what those incentives are, and we're going to talk about quality, and we're going to talk about timeliness, and we're going to talk about cost, and we're going to create some incentives for you to come in with a high quality product on time and under cost. And unless you do that up front, I don't think you can hope that it's just going to happen on its own.
Well, thank you. And if you have any ideas, like I say, we're open on this too. But I think there is a contractor problem. We got to figure out how to say that it's not acceptable to spend $1.8 billion on a 180-bed hospital. Thank you, Senator Baldwin.
The last time that the GAO took a look at year-end spending was in 1998. And I have two questions sort of based on that last exam. When the GAO looked at it, Dr. Fichtner, the USA spending.gov didn't exist. And part of their report mentioned inadequate data on sort of the timing of spending in the federal agencies. And I clearly believe that the website does much to increase transparency, but it's certainly been criticized in some quarters that OMB must address underreporting and lots of inconsistency in the website. So I have a wide open question for you. What did you think of it? What were its limitations, its inconsistencies? How could we do better?
Well, Senator, thanks for the question, because as researchers, we are always looking for better data. And again, you have to give credit where credit is due for President Obama putting this information out for the public and for researchers to use it, because that is what his transparency is about, is putting this information out.
Yeah.
And I know GAO is working heavily with OMB and others to improve the data set. I think the data is useful, but it does have limitations. One is that there's constant updates going on. So if I download data today from last year, so it's a year-old data, and I ask and look at it again 1 week from now, the numbers are different. And there might just be very small changes, but there's still changes. So there are reporting changes going on where agencies say we found some late contracts that came through. There's a lot of reasons why realistically there could be changes, but there still are changes. So you always have to question how clean the data is. There's refunds that go on as well. So I do my best sometimes to go through it, but again, there's 20,000 contracts a year for state, so you try to find the big ones that could affect the numbers in large areas. So I think just sort of, again, having Congress look at it and say, how do we improve it? How do we make it more clean? Getting researchers in who've used it and say, this is great, but how do we make it better? I think it's a great idea, Senator. I appreciate you looking into this as well.
Thank you. And Dr. Joyce, a different question about that GAO report. When they last looked at the issue, it found that procurement reforms were helping to safeguard against improper or unnecessary contracts that had been associated with a rush to spend funds at the end of the fiscal year. It's been quite some time since that report, and Congress has made, and there have been other changes made to the procurement system. So I'm wondering, has anything in your work demonstrated that further changes in law or practice may be necessary, especially in this procurement reform arena?
I have not looked at that, Senator, specifically. I mean, I know that in OMB, OMB has an Office of Federal Procurement Policy, and I know some folks over there, and I know that this is the kind of thing that they're focused on. And I think that, one of the things that would do, one of the things that we should think about is moving beyond the data. I mean, for example, it's one thing to say that the State Department spent 38% of their money. It's another thing to then go into it and say, well, what did they spend the money on, and how can we differentiate between what we think is wasteful and what we think is not wasteful? I mean, that's not a criticism of what Dr. Fichtner did. It's just saying that peeling away additional layers of that onion in order to answer the why and what did we actually get for that money, I think is the next step in this process.
I can answer part of that question again for working for the Department of State. The only way I could have spent that $1 million was on equipment, because you can do quick equipment purchases in a day, all right? I didn't need equipment because I'd already gone through almost every laboratory around Iraq. And I saw every laboratory full of new equipment sitting in the box, unopened, that had already been placed there by either the Department of State or the Department of Defense. They couldn't use it, and yet we were willing to spend more money on equipment. So, right, that's an issue that is there and it needs to be corrected.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. Great hearing.
And Senator, I would also just add real quickly, since you have a little bit of time left, because Dr. Joyce has it in his written testimony, the one thing that can really put a focus on agency spending is congressional oversight. Having this hearing is one example. Call up some of the agencies, have them come, have them tell you why they spent the money, what were these contracts for, have them explain it. That's part of the oversight job.
And if there were repercussions, that your appropriations would actually go down, which would mean we'd have to have an appropriations process. But I want to thank Senator Baldwin for being part of this and the panel for being part of this today, and reiterate that I am open to suggestions on any of this. I don't think this is a partisan issue.
Right.
I think that everything that everybody said had some validity to it, and we have at least the one bill, bonuses for cost cutters, that we're open to suggestions to make the bill better, and then we don't yet have a bill, but we're open to suggestions on something to do with contracting. And I think, but we want to do the same thing. We want some kind of finance. It can include other things, but we do want at least part of the bill, and probably the main focus of the bill, to be financial incentives for people to come in under budget on things that they contract. But thank you for being part of this today. The record will remain open until October 14th for the members to submit additional questions or comments. And with that, the hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Senators.